You give me one good reason why I should send my family that took me a lifetime to raise down that road like a bunch of damn fools to do somebody else's fighting.
Virginia needs all of her sons, Mr. Anderson.
That might be so, Johnson, but these are my sons. They don't belong to the state. When they were babies, I never saw the state coming around with a spare tit. We never asked anything of the state and never expected anything. We do our own living, and thanks to no man for the right.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and it's good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
You know, that little clip with Jimmy Stewart from Shenandoah is a powerful statement about a subject we're going to talk about, and that is the relationship of registration for the draft itself, and fighting wars. And this has been an ongoing fight for a long time because we certainly didn't have a draft in our early history. Matter of fact, I thought it was fascinating that speeches on the Senate floor when the British were burning Washington, D.C. down, there was argument, I think it was Webster or somebody was arguing against the draft. So this is an important issue, and of course, we had the draft up until 1973, and it was very, very controversial during Vietnam. And then in 1979, as a response to the invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter said, we need more, we have to show we're tough. Let's have reinstitute the registration for the draft. So now it's in the news again. It worries me. I don't think it's an academic exercise, defending liberties and change in foreign policy. But there is a court case going on right now, and rather perversely, it looks like there's some people say, well, if we're going to give the men a tough time and force them to do things, I guess the only way we can even this out is to force the women to do the same thing. But what's this business about? Why would somebody go to court, and who's really pushing this case?
Well, it's a national coalition for men, and it's a group fights for men's rights. And they were formed about the issue of divorce, the issue of custody and this sort of thing. So they go out and they're looking for fights. This is now the National Coalition for Men's versus the Selective Service System. And it's a suit they filed that if men are forced to register for draft, women should be too. And it had been sort of cruising along, not doing much. And then last week, Defense Secretary Ashton Carter announced that women henceforth from April 2016 would be eligible for all roles in the military, including combat roles. And that's given this lawsuit a shot in the arm, and it'll be heard before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals next week, I believe, early.
When they talk about the draft, I worry about what are their thoughts. Have trouble with the last 14 years. They had to keep sending the troops back constantly, and they wear the troops out, and they see the downside to this. And when they start talking about the draft and maybe expanding the number of people that they can pull in, it worries me about what they're anticipating or what they might be planning. But that remains to be seen. But one of the issues is a technical issue about this whole business of drafting and putting a lot of foot soldiers out there and then adding the women to it. Because, if we were preparing to defend our country, I don't think that we would be preparing for more grunts to go into the trenches and driving tanks and trucks and getting blown up. It seems so old-fashioned, almost seems like World War I. Not even World War II, World War I. And yet, in this day and age, if we had a decent foreign policy and we had a reason to defend our country, I think women would do every bit as good as men would do. And even if there were threats coming in, I mean, if we're looking at technology, we're not looking for people to, well, how strong are you? How fast can you run? Can you carry a guy that weighs 200 pounds and rescue? That implies we're going to be in these ridiculous wars forever, and that the solution people see because of this case is that, women want to do it, so they have a right to do it, and they should be treated exactly like men. And I agree with that. But I agree that if you want equal justice for individuals. All individuals should be treated equally, and there should be no draft, and there should be no registration of draft. So instead of punishing a group like women to equal men because they're already being punished is absolutely the wrong way to go. What you do is you get rid of the draft and you get rid of the registration, and of course you get rid of the ridiculous foreign policy that we have.
You know, and the penalties for not registering for men now and possibly for women are very steep. $250,000 fine up to prison, denial of any federal job or any government aid or assistance. So this is serious. And you've actually had some experience with some of this.
Yeah, you know, in '79 when this came up, the first vote on reinstituting the draft after it was stopped in '73, we won the vote. It was a coalition, Republicans and Democrats, probably more Democrats. We stopped it, but then another vote came up because then there was the invasion of Afghanistan by those Russians. They said we have to defend ourselves, and therefore that vote passed in 1980. But as a consequence of this, there was a friend, Paul Jacobs, who was a draft resistor. He would not sign up for the draft, and it took about 5 years to find him and catch him and finally punish him. But I think he was the only one, or he was the first one since the Vietnam era, and with the renewal of the draft, so he was being used to be punished, and he ended up going to prison, you know, and you know, having the stigma of having been there. So I testified at his trial, but nobody understood jury nullification. If they did it, they could have just thrown the thing out. But anyway, he was convicted, but once again, it was to show that government's in charge. I think this is the most serious abuse of liberties, you know, where they can literally pick you up and incarcerate you, enslave you. And here I thought there was a prohibition against slavery and involuntary servitude.
And there's the great quote from Reagan against the draft, too.
Right.
And a lot of the military does.
He was very anti-draft.
But, you know, this organization, the National Coalition for Men, they seem to understand how horrific war is for men. This is something from one of their press releases. And skip the first part for now. I mean, ignore the first part. No gender oppression is comparable in magnitude to the deaths of males in war, which includes forced conscription. Over 20 million male soldiers died in World War II, 500,000 of them U.S. Shouldn't that be an argument against these kinds of wars rather than to draw women into the same horror?
And you would think, and I am just so convinced that if we were being attacked, women would be very good fighters and very capable and would know how to shoot a gun and this sort of thing. But I'm under the belief, and I think this can be verified, that a lot of women, single women or otherwise, even women with children, will join the reserves to get a couple extra bucks on the weekend, and they get called up and they go overseas. I think that war, and plus that whole effort, is very destructive to families because a lot of divorces occur, and it's the consequence is so bad. But I think the draft is bad, but I also think the need for a draft is bad, and that's the foreign policy. Right now, I don't know how it would be. American people probably wouldn't vote for the draft, but they also changed their minds. Look how they've changed their minds about expanding the war. They were always against it, bombing, expanding the war. Now they're all for it.
Troops on the ground, yes.
Right.
Well, you mentioned before we started, and I thought this was a really interesting point, you could conceive the idea of women in so-called combat now because we're fighting such different kinds of wars.
Right. The wars we fight now, we shouldn't be doing these field operations and tank attacks. I mean, it's more technological. And what do? We continue to build airplanes, and we continue to build tanks and all these things. Of course, maybe there's some profits in that, but it has so little to do with national defense. If you were truly defending this country, I think women would be very, very capable of managing a lot of this technology. And the irony would be that, well, we don't need a woman to be carrying around somebody that weighs 200 pounds or more. But you know, there's a group right now that's interesting how they flip-flop. During the Vietnam era, which I remember very well, the Black Caucus had a significant impact because for some reason, even though the draft was supposed to be equal, drafts are never equal. They've never been equal because if you drafted everybody, there'd be millions of people you couldn't use. But blacks got drafted and killed more so than before, so they were anti-draft. But now they introduced legislation that's pro-draft because there's not enough people suffering the consequences, and it was the draft that finally ended the war. So an anti-war sentiment is to have the draft and punish everybody again. Well, I would like to change that attitude.
It's a kind of a perverse form of logic to do it this way.
Right. But the other thing is even under today's circumstances, there's some pretty good arguments put out there about the inefficiency when women are under today's conditions in combat. Women are different, and when they're over in Iraq or Syria or in a submarine, things are different. I want to read just a short statement that was a posting on the internet. And this was a reflection by a military person from a 1989 incident. He says, I lived in a co-ed barracks on Camp Hansen, Okinawa. All 7 women on our floor got pregnant, 100%. It was a really bad idea, mixing them on all the issues of trying to keep the women separated. We spent significant resources just trying to deal with it. But when the liberals are confronted with this practical problem, of how you mix people, I guess, they said, well, we have to make sure they understand and have ready access to birth control pills, and that would take care of it all. Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. So. It's
hard to have the strongest military force, as they claim they want, when the barracks are turned into frat houses.
That's for sure. But the 13th Amendment is rather clear. No involuntary servitude and no slavery. And yet it's totally ignored. How can the draft, calling up men and or women if that's what they want, and sending them off and exposing them to death, how can they say this is not involuntary servitude? And yet people never for a minute are hesitant to say, oh yeah, this is necessary. And I'm afraid that if things get out of control, which I think in many ways from the tone of how people are so anxious to use violence to expand the conflict between East and West, is liable to expand this war. Just look at the conditions deteriorating in Iraq and also in Syria, the problems in Ukraine, and the French are more involved, the Germans are involved, the British are more involved. I mean, pretty soon it looks like a world conflict, and this is why I'm concerned about this talk about expanding the draft to include women, because I'm just worried about what their strategy is and what they're preparing for. Well, I'll tell you one thing. If you had a free society and you were protecting liberty, and liberty was being protected as individuals and never by groups, and you had a policy of foreign affairs that wouldn't precipitate these crises by building up the sentiment of blowback and unintended consequences, we wouldn't be having this debate. We didn't have the authority for the draft in our early history. It was never permitted in the Constitution, and it was further emphatic with the 13th Amendment that it would be denied. And yet here we are, okay, I guess if we need them, let's force it on the women too. Well, we need to wake up and understand what individual liberties mean and what it means to have a foreign policy of non-intervention and have a system designed for peace and prosperity. We'd all be better off if we could do that. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and please come back soon.